Bryan Smith here, and welcome to the DreamPath podcast, where I try to get inside the heads of talented creatives from all over the world. My goal is to demystify and humanize the creative process and make it accessible to everyone. Now let's jump in. Jason, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Bryan.
We have a whole year's worth of content to really go back over and chat about. You know, it's a good time of year to reflect back on what we've done, what we've accomplished, and so we'll just take it from there.
Sounds good. We definitely a lot of fascinating guests this year.
Yeah, we really got lucky, I think, with Hiba Jamil and Rika Zatabchi being the first two guests out of the gate. I feel like I was the new kid on the block, no street cred whatsoever, and I had these two amazing guests that said yes to somebody. It took a chance on somebody that didn't have a track record, could have been a total joker. But they took a chance on me, and really the episodes, I think, are two of the best of the entire bunch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We have some clips from these interviews, including Hiba and Rika. So let's listen to Hiba's now.
Painting is a physical act for me. So I paint standing up. I like that movement. I like that gesture. I like the intensity. I started to paint in high school here. That's when I was introduced to painting. In high school, I took an art class, and I got introduced to acrylic. And that's when I started to actually paint. In the beginning, there was a lot of backlash about, why do you paint sexuality? Why can't you just paint at they start to kind of suggest what I should be painting. And I kept on telling them, I don't care what you think. And I kept on telling them that. And I'm like, and then, at one point I wrote a post. I explained that, this is pure art. This has nothing to do with religion, customs, or anything. It's a pure form of art. I always said that art is the thing I love the most in this world, and I don't want anyone to tell me how to do it. I really want to do it the way I want to do it, the way I feel it.
Great clip, Jason.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice job pulling out sort of the essence of what that conversation was all about. What I gathered from Hiba is that she's in many ways, a pioneer coming from a culture that I think probably has a stifling impact on sexuality and on women in general.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And coming from Iraq. But she comes here to the United States and takes on her own perspective, which has some degree of sensuality in her painting within her art, and does it fearlessly, and probably catches shit for it, from people who are looking down upon that form of expression in her culture, or at least the Iraqi culture. And it was just nice to hear her talking about how she dives into the painting physically and is so passionate about it.
Totally, man.
Yeah.
And the art, if you look at the art itself, it's really good.
Yeah.
Like high quality and very expressive.
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed getting to know her and seeing her stuff in the gallery, and then talking to her after the show about her work, and also talking to the people that were in the gallery there to buy art and to look at her work and get their feedback as well. It was a lot of fun.
Well, kudos to her too for having the guts to do it and doing it on her terms.
Yeah, she's a neat lady.
So Rika Zatabchi, is that how you say her name?
Rika Zatabchi.
Zatabchi, yeah. You got lucky with that one, I think.
Lucky is right. I mean, the timing of that one was perfect because she had just won an Oscar, and I had been trying to schedule that interview for quite some time and did not know that she was going to win. I suspected that she had a really good shot of winning, but because of her schedule and promoting the film before the Oscars, we just couldn't connect beforehand. But she had this great documentary called Period, End of Sentence, and agreed to sit down with me after she won the Academy Award. And I went to her apartment in Southern California, in Los Angeles, and got to know her and hear how she became so successful in such a short period of time. I think she was 23 or 24 years old when I was talking to her. And again, I think it's one of those episodes that is going to be timeless because she offers advice to young people. She offers advice to any creatives who are passionate about doing something in a creative space. And with Rika Zitabshi, what stands out the most about her interview is her passion for storytelling and her focus on the importance of story, which she got from her mentors. Dave Junker was one of them. And she doesn't forget that important lesson, even though she has been thrust into basically stardom at this point. I mean, she's an Academy Award winner, but she's really passionate about telling stories and important stories too.
Dave Junker, was my mentor and all of our mentor because he's the head of Film at Academy of the Arts, and he also started Orange County Film Festival. So I remember always tell the story. That's one thing Dave always taught us. Always be character. Always tell the story. Always focus on those things because that's really the heart of any film that you watch. It was always hey, you have access to this really top-notch gear, but don't let that drive you. Don't let that get in your way of really getting to the heart of characters and story.
So what were your thoughts when the second guest on our podcast happens to be an Academy Award winner? What was going through your mind at that point so early in this process and on this journey?
I was actually blown away. I couldn't believe it was happening that quick.
Yeah.
To be honest with you. And really happy for you too. I mean, I was involved in the early stages, but not that involved yet.
Right.
And so when I was kind of in a little bit of disbelief when you had said that you were going to interview this Oscar winner. You'd had her kind of in your crosshairs before that, though, right?
Well, yeah,
months before, you were trying to kind of get a hold of her.
I had a connection to her through a friend.
Okay,
and had been trying to reach her, and but it just didn't seem to come together until the Sundance Film Festival.
Right.
And that's when it all started. And that's when the podcast started solidifying and gelling, and the infrastructure came into place, and it all happened in a pretty magical way. I hate to use that word magical, but I feel
it's kind of true.
I mean, it really feels like I'm just blessed to have this podcast come together the way it has, and to have so many people willing to sit down with me, even though I'm not a Joe Rogan or a Mark Maron or a Tim Ferriss or whoever your favorite podcaster is. I don't have that track record yet, but I just have a passion for what I do. And I think that when I talk to people about the podcast, I think that passion shows. And if you're excited about something, I think it's inevitable that other people are going to be excited about it too.
Totally.
Yeah. So I think that might be part of the recipe for success here.
Mm-hmm.
I come away really feeling like these people are my friends.
Mm-hmm.
I'm making a connection with them that really transcends the interview itself. And I learned something about them that I think is helpful to listeners in more than just a curious way. Oh, what's it like to win an Academy Award? I mean, these interviews go pretty deep into the creative process.
Oh, yeah.
And they go pretty deep into the biography of a creative and how they get to where they're at. And so I feel very honored to hear that story. And at the end of that process, at the end of the interview, and when I upload it to the web and it's out there for everybody to hear, I feel like I have a real strong connection to these people. And that's pretty special to me. Speaking of special connections, Roger and Michael Fisher, episodes 4 and 5, it was such a long interview. We actually had to break it into 2 different episodes. But I did have a connection with them before the interview.
You did, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember how that process came about. I was talking to you about music and old bands that we both loved and listened to, and I remember you said, Bryan, Roger Fisher would be a cool interview, and from Heart. And I was like, you know what? I think I have a connection to them because my dad used to fly Heart. Maybe I'll just see if they remember my dad. So I send an email to Roger Fisher's fan website.
Mm-hmm.
And within 20 minutes, I got a response back.
Nice.
And of course, I name dropped my dad in the email to him. And his response was, "I love your dad. Let's make this happen." And so that interview really meant a lot to me because I got to learn about who my dad was to them. And anytime, he passed away in 2003. But when someone in your family passes away too soon and suddenly, you tend to lose their life story because they weren't expecting to die. You weren't expecting them to die.
Right.
And so I thought that a lot of his life story kind of vanished as soon as he died. But talking to Michael and Roger really illuminated a lot about who my dad was to them in that context. Flying rock and roll stars all over the country. And it's just neat to be able to learn about your dad from people like that, from rock stars.
Yeah. He was a bit of a rock star himself, your dad.
Yeah. Well, I always thought of him as a rock star, but yeah, he technically was not a rock star. He was a pilot to the rock stars. But when you're a kid, that's pretty much a rock star.
I just meant the charisma of your dad.
Oh, yeah. He definitely had the charisma of a rock star. And he was, that sort of fighter pilot swagger, the Vietnam decorated war hero, confidence and swagger, but also a sense of humor that everybody appreciated. And I think that's what took him so far in the business too. People just instantly fell in love with him, and he was the guy that you could always count on. And so when I heard from Ann and Nancy Wilson after he passed away, I really started to understand what he meant to the people that he worked for. And I know they really miss him and felt awful about him passing away too soon.
I was a little starstruck at that interview. I tried not to be, but you grow up listening to Heart. One of the first songs I ever learned on the guitar was Barracuda.
Oh, yeah.
So when you get to meet somebody like Roger Fisher, who, I don't know, as a kid, it's one of those things that's like, you don't think it's going to be a big deal. Kind of was for me,
Yeah.
I grew up listening to this guy's music since I was probably 4, 5. My mom was into Heart. She had a couple of albums. I grew up and went and bought a couple of their albums, and I was a fan. I'm still a fan.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they are in their own ways icons from that era. And Roger's an icon for writing licks like the Barracuda lick or Magic Man. And, Michael is an icon for being the Magic Man.
That's right.
I mean, being the inspiration behind that song. And to hear them weave this story that dates back to the 1960s and all the way to the present, and to actually go to their show and hear them play, I know Michael wasn't playing, but he was there producing, and Roger was playing at this auditorium. But to hear Roger still at it in his, I don't know if he's late 60s, early 70s, but he's getting up there, but he still has this rock star energy.
He does.
Yeah, so it was really cool to be able to see someone doing the thing for that long with the same intensity and energy as he was, and smashing that guitar on stage in the 1970s, and just that energy that is kind of infectious, but also a little bit scary too. You're like, this guy is intense, and I think that's what set creatives like Roger apart from other musicians back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, is their passion was to create. And it wasn't about making money. Yes, it was a little bit about the women and the lifestyle and the drugs and the alcohol at some point. But ultimately, the common thread for all of these icons in that world is their passion to create.
Well, I like what Roger had to say about, I think in the beginning he was talking about he wasn't confident enough, and it took him a while to get his own confidence together to become who he was, becoming himself as a person and becoming himself as a confident human being.
Yeah, I think that's
overcoming.
I think that's what's great about any type of art form that people gravitate to. I think the art form itself can help people become who they were meant to be. And that's the impression that I got from Roger, is that he was a rock star, but there was a shell around him. And that the more he played, the more that shell came off and he became who he is today?
When I started playing guitar, I became somewhat of a recluse and would just play all the time. And I lost some social skills, and Mike would just always do the talking for me. And I became real dependent on that. And I had a real kind of inferiority complex because I wasn't the one who was in charge of my communication part of myself, and I preferred not to be. I'd rather just sit and play guitar. That was some real baggage that I had to confront, and that happened when we were in Heart, and we were in New York City, and we were supposed to do a interview with Life magazine. Life magazine had been out of print for several years, and this was their debut new magazine coming out again, and Heart was featured in it, and we were supposed to go to this big deal interview. But that morning was the morning I decided, I'm going to become my own person now, and I'm going to make my own choices. And my first choice is I'm not going to that interview. I'm going to go walk around New York City and start to be a man who faces his own demons and fears and dragons. And one by one, I'm going to face every fear until I'm not fearful anymore.
One thing that was notable about the interview with Michael and Roger Fisher was that it was a interview with two people at the same time, and you and I had never done that before. And didn't really know what those challenges would be. And it turned out to be challenging for other reasons. I don't think that the fact that there was two people being interviewed was that big of a deal, but there was a lot going on in that space. A lot of activity, a lot of people coming in and out. They have a business where they're making whiskey and tea, and they've got people delivering products throughout the whole interview. And then we had you there trying to help me. I mean, you had questions of your own that you wanted answered, so you're whispering in my ear sometimes. And I think we got through that thing pretty well. And I've heard from some really good feedback from people who were fans of Heart and really liked that interview. So I'm glad it came together pretty well.
Me too. We got to see him. We got to see Roger the night before that interview up in Edmonds.
Yeah,
do a solo show up there, and it was really good.
Yeah, that made it a lot of fun to have that context of seeing him in action and not just going back through YouTube and seeing him on stage in 1975 or whatever. I mean, we have this recent experience of seeing him perform just as energetically and proficiently as he had, 30, 40 years ago. So that was a lot of fun. And also to hear from Michael, who I think the reason he was called the Magic Man is he's a visionary. So his commentary and his perspective on the journey of Heart, starting in the late 60s, early 70s, and going all the way through today with Roger's solo career, I think it's you cannot understand their story without Michael's perspective. And I think Roger would probably agree with that. They're very close, tight-knit brothers, and they experience this journey together. And everything they did creatively was together. So you can't just interview Roger and really understand that journey without talking to Michael. What I'd like to know from both of you, Mike and Roger, is whether at the time that you were creating this music, you knew. Is it one of those moments where you just know this is a hit, and not only is this a hit, but this is going to be legendary?
You have to back up even more than that to get to the knowing part for me, because prior to calling Roger and Steve and telling them to move up with Ann and I had this 3-day experience where I was so excited about the idea for this band that I couldn't sleep. And I was going to school, at the university up there, but all I could do was stay up all night designing equipment and working on a business plan and this and that sort of thing. And then when they did move up, that forced the issue of, well, am I going to do this or am I going to finish my education? It was like this huge thing for me to have to decide. And so it came to the point where one day I had to go one way or the other. And I went down and I stood next to the stream, same stream that's in Crazy on You. And I stood by that stream, and this thing washed over me where I could see the future. I could see what was going to happen one way or the other. And what I saw in the path of our band was that it would be incredible. It would be so successful and so much fun. And I knew that it would work, and I knew how it would end. And I decided, well, it's worth doing. And that, for me, that knowing persisted and carried me through a lot of dark, doubtful days.
And I think what we learned from Michael is that his vision was an extreme long game. He didn't have a short-term vision like, all right, we gotta put this song out and we gotta turn this into a gold or a platinum album. I mean, he was thinking like 3-4 moves ahead every decision they were making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then we talked to another iconic musician, Gerald Johnson, from the Steve Miller Band, episode 6. Gerald was so fun to get to know. What I loved about that interview was that I showed up at his house, and I always try to schedule these interviews in the creative space or in the home of my guest. I think that they're more comfortable there. And when I see posters on the wall or a sculpture on the mantle or an instrument sitting on a stand, those are actually conversational prompts that really help the interview flow the way it should. And so when I walk in to see Gerald for the first time and meet him for the first time, he's got his bass amp, and he's sitting there ready to go. And so he plugs in, and the very first thing he's doing is playing not his old hits, The Joker and Abracadabra from Steve Miller Band, which are great songs.
Oh, yeah.
But he's playing an original song, and he's singing. And so I'm micing things up, and I'm wishing that you were there because you're such a pro with all of the audio stuff and trying to get this thing recorded properly to do it justice, and really got to know him in a way, again, like I feel like he's a friend of mine. And then he leaves me this wonderful review on iTunes afterwards. And those mean a lot to me, those reviews, especially from guests. But he left a very sweet written review, and I'll never forget talking to him and getting to know his journey. And every musician we talk to seems to have, there are common threads, but they have very unique upbringings and influences. And that's what I like to hear, is like, what were your influences? Why did you go in that direction? But it's almost never, the common thread that I see is it's almost never like this master plan. They don't like sketch it out when they're young and say, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm 18 years old. By the time I'm 25, I'm going to have my first gold record, that type of thing. They're very in the moment, and whatever they're passionate about just seems to sort of guide them in a way. Wherever they're going to go, they go. But it doesn't seem to be the product of a master plan, other than they fucking love what they do.
Yes, absolutely.
And they're not going to stop doing that.
The thing that impressed me most about Gerald was the fact that he learned the bass the way he did, which was upside down. He's left-handed, but rather than stringing it left-handed, he learned it from the right-hand stringing, which is the total opposite of what you would learn an instrument.
Right.
And man, the guy is incredible.
How did you find the bass guitar as your instrument?
Interesting. Find it as my instrument. Nobody has really put that question to me and with that kind of wrapper around it there, Brian. I was in boarding school, and there was a kid from Baton Rouge, Louisiana named Alfred Lucas. He had a Fender Precision. He had been playing bass a few years, and Fats Domino's son went to that same school. Antoine came in '66, and we knew that Alfred Lucas had a bass. So Antoine said, Gerald, why don't you go ask Alfred if we can borrow his bass? And I went, ask him if we can. I said, nobody wants to. He goes, just ask him. I'm sure he'll let us use it. Sure enough, he said, go look under my bunk. You know, we're in a boarding school in Lafayette, Louisiana. Look under my bunk and be sure to put it back in the case when you're done. He said, sure. So I picked it up, and in a very short period of time, I had some kind of bond with that instrument that I was not looking for. The way it felt up against my chest, the way the wood vibrated. You know, I was 16. You know, I had not been exposed to any, I'd never even picked up an instrument that I can even remember and held it up close to me like that.
And with some of these musicians, like Gerald, there's a turning point in their career where they realize that drugs and alcohol are really hindering them artistically. And it seems to be a crossroads that they face. And Gerald was one of those musicians where he just made a decision that he had to stop drinking and became sober. And I think was pleasantly surprised that he was able to do it sober, and not just do it, but actually perform better sober than he had ever performed intoxicated or while drinking.
I had to change some of my habits so I could continue to do this. It was really difficult because it was something that hadn't been done in about 27 years. But it didn't take long to realize that it even felt better. There was a level of clarity that had been forgotten about.
I think you're right, too. I think the ones that don't figure it out end up, well, a lot of them aren't with us anymore.
Right.
You know?
And then we talked to quite a character, BJ Liederman. I did not expect the adventure that he took me on when I flew to Asheville, North Carolina to meet him. But I'm very glad that I made the trip. And we saw each other for the first time at a cafe. That's where he wanted to meet. It's one of his favorite diners in Asheville, the outskirts. And got to know him and his girlfriend, and I brought my daughter along. And then we started the interview not in a house, not in a studio, but in the hills on a hike.
Right, outdoors.
Yeah. That was very interesting because there were bears around, and I noticed that BJ had bear spray in his back pocket and was clapping his hands and yelling, and I was like, what is going to happen here? Are we going to have to fight a bear?
Do what I usually do when I enter the woods. I'll say, walking here. Yeah, walking there. Yeah, walking here. Gone now, gone. And that basically gives them an idea of where the trouble is.
He was just a lot of fun to hang out with. He's the type of guy that is pretty spontaneous and impromptu, and he doesn't want to do things by the book. And I think that's the way he's kind of lived his whole life. And then we heard from BJ sort of the origin story of how those NPR theme songs made their way into everybody's musical consciousness back in the 70s and 80s.
I had given my cassette tape of jingles, my jingle demo cassette, to my good friends Skip and Jerry Peasy. And as Skip tells me, one day he went to his mailbox down there, and there was a little piece of paper from the desk of Jim Russell, who was the new producer of Morning Edition. And the piece of paper said, "Get me BJ Liederman," underlined exclamation point.
I think they just now switched over after like 40 years of using BJ's theme songs.
Wow.
NPR started using a new theme. And even though BJ might not be a household name for everybody, I think his music, if you've ever listened to public radio. And so I really enjoyed getting to know BJ in his hometown of Asheville, which, by the way, is a really cool town. Yeah, Asheville is one of those towns that, you know, there's shirts that you can buy in shops that say, "Keep Asheville weird." And it's a weird town. There's all kinds of music going on, a lot of busking on the street corners.
Nice.
A lot of great restaurants, live music everywhere. It's a college town, gorgeous city, and a lot of creatives there, including BJ. And a real special interview we had was with Alfredo Araguin, which is episode 8. And Alfredo is a painter who has work in the Smithsonian. And I really didn't know a lot about the art world other than talking to Hiba Jamil. So that was my first guest, obviously, episode 2. I didn't really know a lot about the long game of the art world. And Alfredo has played the long game for sure. He started off in the 1950s, I believe, in Mexico, and has the keys to the city of Morelia because of all of the good work that he's done down there. And he's an iconic figure in Mexico and in the United States. But to get to know Alfredo in his home in Seattle and see his many paintings on the walls of his home, but also to be taken down into his basement where he does his work, and to see these incredible paintings, huge paintings that take up entire walls in progress, weeks and weeks worth of work already on the canvas, weeks and weeks of work yet to be done on the canvas.
Right.
And to be pulled into that universe for that period of time, for the couple hours that I was with him, it's unforgettable. And I just am so grateful for that time with Alfredo, and also to have that relationship and that connection result in the interview with Tess Gallagher, which we'll talk about later. But I really enjoyed getting to know Alfredo. One similarity I did notice between Hiba and Alfredo, even though Hiba is a lot younger than Alfredo, and she has been at it a few years while Alfredo's been at it for decades.
Right.
They both have the same approach to why they are doing what they're doing. And it's an extremely selfless approach to art, which is they want to make a positive impact on the world. And they want everybody to be able to see their art and enjoy it. And Alfredo talks about that in his interview.
I have my paintings in hospitals and retirements homes and things to inspire people.
Yeah.
And it makes me really happy that that art is not a way to be famous and rich, but it's a way to connect not only through your paintings, but spiritually. You make connections with people and real good friends.
Very interesting story of, Alfredo seemed to have not such a great childhood. We hear about that a lot with artists. His upbringing was not great.
No. There's I think that conflict during childhood and adolescence is obviously not a good thing, but it does create a type of ambition and drive in artists that leads to success. And I think we see that in music, and we see it in writing, and we see it in painting.
And the tie-in there is what I was getting at, was that Hiba and him both kind of had similar.
Right.
And his was more of like neglect and abuse. Hers was more wartime, being in fear all the time, living in that, and kind of that influencing kind of their way of expressing it creatively.
Right. Trauma, whether it's trauma from neglect or from living in a war zone, that trauma is going to have an impact on your creative vision and the type of art that you create. And but the common denominator between these artists, as I see it, is that Hiba and Alfredo are not in it for the money.
Right.
They are not doing this to become millionaires, and they're not millionaires. They're struggling to make a living just like everybody else. And they may have good times and they'll have some bad times. It's an up and down world economically for artists. But that's not what matters to them. What matters is that they're able to create in their own way and do it their way.
As you may have noticed, there are great resources and advice mentioned in all our episodes. And for many of them, we actually collect all of these resources for you in one easy place, our newsletter. You can go to dreampathpod.com/newsletter to join. It's not fancy, just an email about each week's episode, featured artists, and resources to help you on your journey. Thanks. And now back to the interview.
Well, speaking of artists that do what they do, not for the money, but for the passion of creating in that space, Greg Mariotti, episode 9. And this is one of my favorite episodes of all time.
Mine too.
Because for a couple of reasons. One, Greg is my age, and he was in the banking industry for 20 years before he left to work in film. And not only work in film, but work for friggin' Cameron Crowe. I mean, talk about a film legend. Jerry Maguire and Almost Famous and all these great movies.
Great films.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But he took this leap of faith and left a very lucrative job in the banking industry to do something completely different. And I really connect with that, being his age and also being someone who has wanted to make the leap myself. And that's actually why I created this whole podcast. If you listen to episode 0, or episode 1, actually, they call it episode 0. But if you listen to episode 1, the whole purpose of me starting this podcast was sort of encapsulated in Greg Mariotti's story. So that's why I really appreciated that conversation with him.
It's a great conversation.
And to work on a documentary like the David Crosby documentary with Cameron Crowe and, of course, David frickin' Crosby, to be a part of that creative process, to be a producer on the movie, to get invited to Sundance Film Festival, and possibly to be nominated for an Academy Award is just jaw-droppingly amazing to me. And I try not to use that word amazing too much because I think it's overly used. But his journey, Greg's journey, is so impressive and inspiring. I think that's the one word that I would use to describe his interview, is inspiring. And it inspired me. I hope it inspires others.
I'd say documentaries in general are a labor of love. You've got to have a genuine passion for the subject matter. And I think you have to be willing to put a spin on it because there has been so many. You don't want to fall into the trap of just a bunch of talking heads commenting on an artist, a band. It feels like it's been done a lot. And so that was one thing that we tried really hard. People ask us all the time, like, why don't you have new interviews with Neil or with Steven or with Graham? Well, first of all, we didn't ask those guys to do interviews.
Yeah.
They might have said no if we would have asked, but that was never the plan. The plan was always to let Crosby tell us his story, because why would you not want to lean on this guy who can tell amazing stories, who has so much charisma, has so much honesty, and is such a great storyteller? So that's what we tried to do with this film, is really do that. Could you do that with every documentary? Probably not, because you have to have a subject matter that can weave those stories. And I think Crosby is sort of in a league of his own in terms of being able to do that.
You had an encounter with David Crosby.
Oh, yeah.
Or you approached him. Right?
Yeah, I did. I should not have done that.
Was he mad?
Yeah, he should have been mad. I approached him in the middle of a conversation. He was at a dinner at the Sundance Film Festival, and I was there as a guest, the artist at the table dinner, and he was talking to Robert Redford's daughter, Amy Redford, and I approached him asking for a picture like a fucking idiot, and he treated me, as he should have treated me, which is like an annoyance. I might take a picture, but right now I'm in a conversation, so get the fuck out of here, basically.
Right.
He didn't use those words, but that's
the impression you got, though.
Yeah. So that's actually a good lesson for me, because sometimes I am an approacher, sometimes I impose myself on stars when really the respectful thing to do is to treat them like a human being. Not some type of oddity. That they have to just stop whatever they're doing and give you whatever you're asking of them at the moment. One person I talked to that I felt was on a different wavelength than me creatively because of her energy level and just how hard she works was Bettina Gillois.
Oh, yeah.
The level of productivity that she's at all day long and the intensity with which she approaches her work was really intimidating for me to hear. And I enjoyed getting to know her, and she's actually a lovely person, and friendly and affable, and just someone that you would want to go out to lunch with and have coffee with and probably mentor you. And she does mentor people. She's a screenwriting professor at Chapman University, but she operates at a very high level in terms of output. And she's just constantly working and thinking about the next project and the current project. And that's the impression I got from Bettina, which is, if you want to be successful in any industry, you're going to have a much better chance at success if you work your ass off.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest lessons I took away from Bettina. And also, her approach to story and storytelling was something that I'd never heard before, which is something she describes as story logic.
I have something that I just call story logic that applies to life. I literally see that lives transpire in a way just like stories do. So in real life, I will have a friend ask me, how something terrible just happened, and what if this happens as a result? And I say, no, that's not going to happen because that's not the way the story goes. I can literally sort of predict. I say, tell me the beginning and I can tell you the ending. I have a theory of there's an electromagnetic process to life. We are energetic beings, and when we talk about people, we talk about them in terms of energy. They're energetic, they are powerful, they're in charge. Many, many words that we ascribe to human beings have to do with energy. And I put this in one of my scripts. Electromagnetic energy works along magnetic poles, so you have this polarity, which is also part of story always. You always go from opposite to opposite. You start on one side, you have to end up on the other. That's how a story works. The most satisfying story will always end up on polar opposites. And in life and in story, what you pursue will run away. And what you run away from will pursue you. It's literally, that's the nature of all stories and life.
And what I love about story logic is that you can look to your own life or to the lives of other people as something that either follows or doesn't follow traditional story logic.
Right.
And so if you look at story logic as a guide on how to tell a good story, you can look for the threads in people's lives that are going to make for a good story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And so that's why I think she makes such a great biography storyteller. She's able to go into the lives of real people and find the essence of what they're all about or what their career was all about. And how is that going to resonate on film? And she just has a really special talent for that. With, the Bessie biopic on HBO, McFarlane USA with Kevin Costner, and the Muscle Shoals documentary that she's putting together with Johnny Depp. I think that's why she has found such a niche in that industry, is that she's super talented at finding aspects of people's lives that are going to fit within that story logic that resonates on film and in books.
Right.
And two guests that we talked to back were Ricardo Fraser and Hollis Wong Ware. And Ricardo was the first guest that we talked to who was not a traditional artist, so to speak.
Right.
He is a producer and a manager and had managed Sir Mix-a-Lot for many years and still does, but also has a business where he promotes artists in kind of a unique way. And it was neat to hear someone like Ricardo talk about the way he carved his own path. He was kind of a trailblazer in a way.
Mm-hmm.
How he carved his own path, and he's not a musician. This guy is not a writer, he's not a musician, he's not a painter, but somehow he was able to be in that creative space by helping other artists become better and become successful.
What was interesting in terms of my path, and I go back to my dad being a musician back in Costa Rica, right? I have clear memories of sitting with him while he played. He's an amazing guitarist. And I think the idea of music was built into me through his creative process and creative life. And so I've always loved the arts, right? Even as I pursued a career as an environmental scientist. And so the arts was always back here, right? And so while I pursued those earnings, I always dabbled in some form of fashion in the arts because I loved the idea of working in the arts, particularly in music. I couldn't sing. I can't play any instruments, right? But again, that love for music and the arts was just instilled in me from a young age. So I just kept trying to figure out what can I do?
And through that connection to Ricardo Fraser, I was able to interview Hollis Wong Ware
Nice.
in Los Angeles. And Hollis was kind enough to invite me into her home studio, her recording studio, to talk about her work with Macklemore and beyond. And her work with Macklemore resulted in a Grammy nomination on the Heist album, but also really helped her become well known in the industry so that she is able to not have to have a day job, basically, and create. And that's what she does. She sings, she writes music, she performs with Flavor Blue. She travels all over the world. If you follow her on Instagram, you can see her playing with Flavor Blue and other musical acts in Japan, Seattle, Los Angeles. And her story is really unique as well. I mean, you listen to her TED Talk. Just look her up on YouTube. There's a TED Talk that she does where she talks about her journey and the influence of her mother and her mom's work ethic on her own musical journey and the spoken word poetry that she does. Really a neat person and someone I was privileged to talk to.
Originated from Seattle too, right?
She started in San Francisco, but really her roots are in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how she met Macklemore. And I found her story about helping him write the song White Walls was incredible. I mean, to hear the behind the scenes making of a song from scratch where you're in a cafe with Macklemore and that he's got a notebook and a pen and she's sort of guiding him through the process of this story of the lyrics of White Walls and what that means to him. And then she wrote the hook on that song and got to sing it on the album. And then that took her all the way to the Grammy Awards. I think it was in 2014. What a story she had. And one thing I try to do in these interviews is ask them to give advice to a room full of young people that are wanting to do what she does.
Right.
Or that are wanting to do something creative. And Hollis had a great answer to that question.
You have to try a lot of stuff to know what most speaks to you. And so don't ever inhibit your ability to grow or to experiment and to try. And you can't wait around for permission to develop as a creative. You can't wait around for somebody to give you like a smile and a nod and tell you to walk forward. Like the best way to go is to find that smile and your nod within yourself and to find that internal affirmation to believe that you're worthy of developing as a creative.
So as much as I enjoy getting to know these artists, I also appreciate that they have a lot of wisdom to impart to my listeners, not just to me, but to anybody who is looking to do something creative and work in a creative space.
I know I'm learning a lot just by listening and doing the work.
Another Los Angeles musician we spoke to who was in a completely different genre of music than Hollis Wong Ware was Richard Patrick.
That was one of my favorites.
Yeah?
And hardest.
What do you mean by that? What was so difficult
just
about
the editing of it. I mean, he's a very energetic guy, as you know. You were there, you know.
Oh, yeah.
There were times where he was spoke in a very normal tone, and then there were some very excitable moments on there where he spoke a little loud, I suppose you could say.
One might even say scream.
Yes.
Yeah, into the mic. And that's what made the interview so fun and unpredictable. And I think it's probably the most high energy interview I've had.
Right.
One of the takeaways from the interview with Richard, for me, was his perspective on artistic freedom.
I went off and I did my own thing, and I fucking did it my way. You know, I did it on my terms. This entire past 30 years has been what I wanted to do. That's freedom.
That's probably one of the most memorable quotes from any of these interviews is, Richard's perspective on doing things his way and the importance of that.
Totally.
Richard's a really special guy. I mean, I think he's in his early 50s, but he is still performing high energy rock at concerts and recording, but he's also doing film scores.
That's right.
Yeah. So he's kind of broadened his horizons with the film score business that he has. During episode 16, we took a pretty dramatic turn from the interviews with the musicians in Los Angeles. Episode 16 was actor Jerry Shea. You remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Jerry was, I think, the first interview that we had where we did it remotely via the internet.
Internet, that's right.
I was a little worried about my ability to connect with the guest without seeing them in person, face to face, being in their creative space. But Jerry was great and was really generous to take time out of his shooting schedule to talk to me about City on a Hill and his experience working with those actors on that Showtime series, which I thought was great.
Mm-hmm.
I watched the entire series before our interview, and also watched his Broadway musical Passion, which is a Stephen Sondheim musical, and tried to get a sense of his work, and really was impressed with the range that Jerry has, starting with Passion in the early 90s, singing incredibly challenging and complicated Stephen Sondheim songs for 2 hours on stage every single night on Broadway, and getting nominated for a Tony for that work. And then all the way through his film career, and then his retirement to focus on family, and then being brought out of retirement to work on City on a Hill with Kevin Bacon, the Showtime series.
He's very diverse.
Yeah.
And that was what impressed me the most too, about he's a family guy.
How difficult of a decision was that after being nominated for a Tony, and also being a film actor? I think you had just acted in Southie by that point.
Mm-hmm. It was a difficult one, but it seemed like a no-brainer to me. That said, in a way, in all candor, it's like cutting off a limb sometimes, but it has to happen. It still, as hard as it was to let this go, it was an easy decision for me when I knew what the downside of it was. If I have to choose between making a living doing something that I love and being home with my wife and children, to me, it was just a simple one. And I have never regretted that.
And Jerry told us about, what it was like to work on Broadway versus working on television versus film. And that was kind of a cool perspective to have. I don't think we had really had that type of discussion before on the podcast.
We had this nude scene, and we were getting into the bed on the set before the curtain rises, and suddenly the curtain rises and the house lights are still up, and everyone just looks up at us. I just waved to the crowd, and we just both turned and smiled at the crowd and say, "See you in a few minutes." And the curtain eventually came back down. We started the show over again. Those things happen all the time in theater, and there are times in a run when you do something close to a year or even more sometimes where you welcome those things, because it resets the tone and it puts everybody on edge in a really wonderful way, so that every night it reminds you that every night needs to happen for the first time.
After talking to Jerry Shea, we really took a 180-degree turn when we talked to Dan Friday and to Dylan Newworth.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Dan Friday is a glass artist from Seattle who works with Dale Chihuly, who's a world premier glass blower and glass artist. And Dan has been doing this for 2 decades now, working with Dale, but also really establishing himself as a unique voice in the glass space. I had never really looked at how glass art was made until talking to Dan Friday and going to the gallery and seeing his work, and then going on YouTube and actually watching this process happen. And then to hear Dan talk about how he got his start was also inspiring in a way that Greg Mariotti was, because Dan did not go to school to become an artist, and he became inspired to work with glass in a pretty unique way.
I was 20 years old, and I had gone to vocational tech school as a mechanic. I owned a tow truck. I was on this path to be a car gypsy of sorts, or whatever that is. But when I saw the avenue of working with glass, being able to create things with my hands as opposed to fix it, working on car, I just knew that's what I was going to do. And so that was a great moment for me, I think.
Dan's beginnings vocationally were working with his hands, and he thought he was going to work with cars and be a mechanic, or as he put it, a car gypsy. But it turned out that his ability to think mechanically and work with his hands really helped him accomplish what he wanted to accomplish creatively. And I think that his ancestors and the creativity that ran through his bloodline basically really drove him into doing what he was meant to do, which was to be an artist in this space, which is inaccessible to a lot of people. But because of his ability to work with his hands and his understanding of glass and metal and heat and all of the elements that go into making this type of art, he was able to take, what I think he was destined to do based upon his ancestry and his family history, and actually execute and make that happen in the space of glass blowing.
Amazing work.
Yeah. And one friend of Dan's is Dylan Newworth. And how I met both Dan and Dylan was a friend of mine named Wilbur Kelly, who has worked with Dale Chihuly for many years. But Dylan, who also worked with Dale, is not a glass blower and he's not a glass bender, but nope. he's a neon artist. And just like with Dan, I didn't know anything about neon other than there are neon signs out there. I made the mistake of calling one of Dylan's pieces a sign.
Right. I remember that.
And I'll never make that mistake again because it isn't a sign. It's definitely a standalone piece of art that Dylan had the vision to put together. And, the way that he uses a team of people to almost like a rock band. I think Dan Friday talked about that.
Right.
Used that metaphor as well. You have the drummer and the guitar player and the bass player, and everybody has to do their thing to make it sound right.
Right.
Same thing with glass blowing, and same thing with neon. There's a whole team of people that are behind the scenes making this happen.
Right.
And it was really cool to hear Dylan's story of what really inspired him to work with neon.
But when I got sober, it was when the work became more personal. I realized that I had this like huge cavern of radioactivity in me because, it wasn't like I just woke up and said, hey, let's party. I mean, it's kind of how I grew up too, which is heavily linked to how I got into the medium of working with illuminated like neon, right? I mean, that comes from how I grew up. I mean, I had this, I've told the story a million times, but it never is not resonating, right?
Right.
Is that, in my kitchen where I grew up, my mom, she, her second husband and that had started dissolving, and our dad wasn't in the mix. And so we had, my brother and my sister and my mom lived in this house, and so like way out in the woods and stuff. And there was in the kitchen though, her second husband had given her a neon sign that said her name, Judy, but it said Judy's, like it's her place, but kind of like a bar.
Yeah.
And that was in our kitchen. And then there was also a black and white TV in the corner, and then under the sink in this cabinet, lit with like fluorescent lights, was where she kept, the bourbon, right? So, at night she'd get home, and she was an English professor, and she worked in, continuing education. She's brilliant, and she had the Trashy Book Club, this kind of proto-feminist kind of book club, and all these like university women got together and drink wine, talk about John Opdyke and stuff like that. So it was
that's
just,
cool.
Cool household, right? But at night, she was definitely had a drinking problem. And so she would, do all the stuff and the responsibilities, but then she would, invariably, pass out, right?
Yeah.
So I'd be up late at night and had that, black and white TV. I turned on that sign because the transformer was under the stove, on this side of the kitchen. Turn that sign on, which like this red glow, and you had the TV with like this, the black and white, watching like Blade Runner for the first time, which is not a black and white movie, Terminator, RoboCop, like all this late night
futuristic stuff,
totally, which is in sci-fi. So I'm just like able to escape into this world, and then the light under the stove or the cab to the sink, with the bourbon, right? So it's kind of like this environment, and so it took me like getting sober and just kind of like diving in like I had something to prove, which I probably did. It was kind of like I'm proving I'm alive. I'm proving I'm like have wasted all this decade of time, in this black hole. I've got something to say. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to keep saying it. And that, I'm not a piece of shit. And like, also like, hey, I'm sorry to all these people. Like, I think I've like let you all down in some way, and I've let myself down. Right. Yeah. But it took a while to really understand. I just was really recreating that room. Every single thing I did was kind of like this installation about something I was feeling impulsively inside to communicate. A very focal point neon piece and other kind of props, if you will, things. And it just took me a long time to go, oh, wow, that's that room.
It's so cool to hear artists talk about events in their life that may occur when they're 5 years old, but that still reverberate in their psyche and their consciousness to this day.
Mm-hmm.
and it affects how they view their work, and it affects how that creativity manifests. And after talking to Dylan, we kind of got back into film and talking to Tracy Rector, who is a Pacific Northwest film producer and director. And Tracy is in kind of a unique space in film because she is not in Hollywood. She's doing documentary films about Indigenous people and the issues that are specific to Indigenous people and the issues that Indigenous folks face and have faced for decades.
Yeah.
And Tracy has produced over 400 films.
It's amazing.
Over the last couple of decades. And such a prolific filmmaker and artist and an important figure in the Seattle community, on all kinds of commissions and boards. And again, this is someone just like with Hiba, just like with Alfredo. These are people that are doing what they do. They're not for the money, but because it's important for our culture. And that's something that I have an immense amount of respect for, to not be driven by commerce and not be driven by the dollar. And I think what happens is when you are so passionate about your work and you're focusing on what's important, the money will come. You're going to be compensated for what you do.
Right.
But it may not result in you getting an Academy Award, even though Tracy won an Emmy for her work on Dawnland.
That's right.
And she finally got, after all these decades, I think a pretty significant accolade, which is an Emmy. But that's not important to her either. I mean, of course, she appreciates being recognized in that forum, but that's not why she does it.
No.
That's not why anyone does this type of work. And so it was a lot of fun to talk to Tracy. And after talking to Tracy in episode 24, we talked to Jeff Hamilton.
That was a fun one.
That was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff is impressive for a lot of reasons, but what struck me about Jeff in the interview with him was that from the age of 12, Jeff has done nothing but music. And I, you and I both were talking about this in our recap of Jeff's episode. Parallels between his life and your life.
Oh, yeah.
Are pretty amazing.
Coincidental for sure.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The fact that you both started recording at a very early age, doing multi-track,
right.
Kind of like, primitive multi-track recording.
Very primitive.
But doing it yourself, like learning how to do this yourself.
Right.
Trial and error. And he has been in the music industry for so long and has been regarded by his peers as preeminent in his field in terms of audio recording.
For sure.
Audio engineering. To such a degree that he's been brought on board to record Violent Femmes albums. He toured with Violent Femmes for 10 years.
Right.
He has played for Dennis DeYoung. He's played for Uriah Heep, slide guitar for them.
Nice, yeah.
And now he's about to go on tour with Beatallica, his mashup band.
Which I love.
Yeah.
I absolutely love
He's going
Beatallica.
to travel to Montreal and to Moscow, Russia. But what an exciting life. And again, these are not household names necessarily, but they're people that are doing what they love to do, and they are successful, and they're making it happen. And I think that's inspirational in and of itself.
I have a lot of respect for that.
Me too. And finally, the last guest of the year, our special Christmas episode, was with Tess Gallagher.
She seems like a great lady.
Tess is a really special poet and short story writer to me, because, and I talk about this, I won't go over it too much because I talk about it in the intro to her episode, what she means to me and why.
Yeah.
But being able to talk to Tess in her home in Port Angeles, not just one of her homes, but both of her houses in Port Angeles, and the second home being the home she shared with Ray Carver, one of my all-time favorite short story writers. To hear her perspective on writing and creativity and the journey that she's been on and the journey she was on with Ray Carver was really special. And I felt honored that she let me in to her world to talk about that.
I know you talked about it, but just being in that space, how did you feel? Did it feel like you're in this historical place with this energy that, Ray Carver had been there and they lived together there? And
well, yeah, she took me into her office, which was Ray Carver's office for years when they lived there together, and he died in that home.
Wow.
But his office space was pretty well preserved the way it had been when he died. So his library was there. His framed pictures and awards were all over the walls. I'll put some pictures up on the website shortly that show how packed this house is with memories. I mean, there's just pictures on every wall. There's movie posters. There's the Birdman poster, which is the Michael Keaton movie that won an Oscar, directed by Alejandro Iñárritu.
Yeah, good.
And she, Tess was brought in to consult on that film. It was based upon a short story by Ray Carver. There's pictures of Tess with director Robert Altman when she was consulting on the movie Shortcuts with him. But to be in that house with all of those memories and all of that history, it felt like a privilege and an honor. And I'll never forget it.
I really loved the poem she read too.
Yeah. And for her to take a poem that she had just written and read it on mic and to share that with me was another special part of the interview. I mean, there's so many great parts. I mean, the one thing that I get self-conscious about sometimes is that I am geeking out over something that no one else is going to get excited about. It's like, okay, who gets excited about a poet or a short story writer or an author of any kind? I don't know, but I do. And the fact that she was able to, 25 years after I first met her at a reading at a bookstore in Bellingham, when she was reading from her book, The Lover of Horses, she didn't know who I was back then, but I became a huge fan after talking to her, having her sign my book. But the fact that she was able to invite me into her home 25 years later and share with me her life story. I mean, it's a fraction of her life story. It's a lot more rich and complex than we were able to put on mic in an hour's time.
Sure.
But that felt like a gift to me. And those are the types of gifts that I really appreciate and that kind of keep me going in the podcast world. And they make me want to continue doing this throughout 2020 and beyond.
Right on.
One of the interesting perspectives that she shared with us during the interview was how truth can be found more in fiction than in facts. That truth kind of gets lost in facts and it loses its meaning. But if you put it in the context of fiction, you can actually find more truth.
Fiction arranges for something to be truer than factual. Facts tend to be a kind of cement, And when you have cement, you don't have any prismatic understanding of whatever you're talking about, really. It's just, there you have an imprint, maybe you might call it.
Right.
Fiction is very good, because you have to wrestle the snake, and I think I was just writing to Alejandro González Iñárritu about fiction and saying that you can reach ultimate truth through fiction.
Yeah. So, Jason, I want to thank you for a great year. 2019 has been fun, challenging, intense, exciting, so many words. I can't find the words to describe how much I appreciate you being my co-pilot on this journey. And where we're at today is a result of a lot of hard work and creativity and passion. And I couldn't have done it without you.
I appreciate that, Bryan.
Yeah. So hopefully in 2020, we will be able to continue putting out episodes at the pace that we're putting them out now, which is once every 2 weeks, have a new guest, and every other week, have a recap of each one of those guests.
Welcome to 2020, Bryan.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Hey, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the DreamPath podcast. If so, I have a favor to ask. Can you go to your favorite podcast service and give me a rating and review? Your feedback is what keeps this podcast going. I appreciate your time, and as always, go find your dream path.